My name is Tom Duesterberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Manufacturing Program here at the Aspen Institute. I want to welcome you all here today. We have a wonderful program, some wonderful individuals on our panel, and so I'm not going to take very much time away from the panel. Let me just briefly thank our sponsors. Sponsors of this event include the Bertelsmann Foundation, the Association for Women in Science, and Deloitte. And I also wanted to thank my other sponsors of my program, which include the Manufacturers Alliance for Productivity and Innovation, National Association of Manufacturers, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Bison Gear and Engineering, the Apollo Group, Madison Capital Partners, Parker Hannifin, Snap-on Tools, Kennametal, Rockwell Automation, and the Dover Corporation. I'm pleased to introduce for a few opening remarks Annette Heuser, who's the Executive Director of the Washington office of the Bertelsmann Foundation. Annette studied law, political science, and sociology in Germany and has written widely on foreign policy, transatlantic relations, and EU affairs. She's an expert on education, and I think the challenge that we're going to be discussing today is equally important in Europe as it is here in the United States. So, Annette?
Yeah, also warm welcome from my side, and thank you so much, Tom, for your introductory remarks. It's great to be here, and I think we have a very important topic to discuss. We all know that the manufacturing sector is one of the booming, most growing sectors in the United States, and in Europe and my home country, Germany, manufacturing was and still is one of the backbones of our economy, and in particular when it comes to the German export. And for us at the Bertelsmann Foundation, operating on both sides of the Atlantic, it's very important to hopefully draw some lessons learned out of today's debate, what we can learn from the opportunities and demands of the manufacturing sector on the one side, and on the other side of the demands and opportunities and expectations of women on the other side. Because as we all know, women are still, until today, the most underutilized resource in our society, in our economy, and I think this is in particular the case when we talk about the manufacturing sector. And we have a fantastic panel of female leaders in the sector today to discuss some of the core issues when it comes to the question, how can we bring more women into the manufacturing sector? And I think on the one side, we will address the issue of this kind of opaque stereotyping of women in the sector. And on the other hand, we will address some very concrete proposals, how we can increase role models in the industry, how we can increase the STEM programs, vocational training, and just to provide a better level playing field for women in the sector. So without any further ado, I would like to give the floor back to Tom. Thank you all for joining, and I have no doubt we will have a very fascinating debate today. Tom.
And it's now my pleasure to introduce Janet Bandos-Koster, who's the Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer of the Association for Women in Science, our co-sponsor for the program. Janet has served as ED and CEO of AWIS since 2006. She has over 25 years' experience leading organizations in both the U.S. and overseas, with particular expertise in global gender and workforce issues. She's authored numerous reports and presented at professional meetings about the nexus of gender in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. She's a principal investigator and co-principal investigator on several federal grants, including awards, which is advancing ways of awarding recognition in disciplinary sciences, which partners with 20 disciplinary societies to increase women's contribution for research in enterprise. And she's the author of a new book, just came out in February, on STEM education, which I think she may say a word or two about. Janet.
Thanks to everybody for being here today after such a nasty day yesterday. Big thank you first to Aspen and to the Bertelsmann Foundation for partnering with AWIS today on a topic that is getting a lot of attention in the United States right now. Advanced manufacturing is certainly being talked about as the solution to America's innovation, competitiveness, and economic growth. And as part of that equation, we need to continue to think about how we engage women, how we engage underrepresented minorities as part of that discussion. Oftentimes, the image of advanced manufacturing is very one-sided. And I think today's discussion will bring out some very rich dialogue and some solutions to not only how we get girls into the pipeline, but how we keep them in the pipeline. And shameless promotion for the new book out of AWIS, that's exactly what we talk about. It's equitable solutions for retaining a robust STEM workforce. And it's very focused on, once we've gotten women into the pipeline, how do we keep them there? How do we look at workplace structures? How do we look at federal policies? And how do we think about some of the ways that we can adapt workplaces in the STEM fields so that we're retaining all of our best talent, as Annetta referred to? I'd like to introduce my co-author who is here today, Dr. Donna Dean. And we'll be happy to answer questions or sign books after the event. But with further ado, Tom, I'd like to have you introduce our great panel. We're so glad that all of you could make it today. Thank you again on behalf of the Association for Women in Science.
Thank you, Janet. And I'd like to invite our panelists to take seats up front. And while they're doing that and getting mics on, I'll give a short introduction to all of them. Our moderator today is Teresa Maldonado. Dr. Maldonado is currently serving as the executive or the director of the Division of Engineering, Education, and Centers, EEC, and the director of engineering at the National Science Foundation. She's been there since 2011. Normally it's a 2-year stint, I think, but perhaps you've extended yours just a little. Whoa, a little bit. Amongst other things, in recent roles, Teresa has developed partnerships with industry, state and federal government agency, and others for funding, technology commercialization, and regional economic development. She led the creation of a major research program in wind energy, including 2 research agreements with large international companies, and the formation of a wind energy center under the EEI. Teresa has a doctorate in electrical engineering from Georgia Tech, and has lots of interesting stories to tell about her apprenticeship, if you will, in the engineering profession. Let's see, who do we have? Karen Fletcher, sitting next to Teresa, is Vice President of Dupont Engineering and Chief Engineer. She joined Dupont in 1982 in the engineering field program and was assigned to Parkersburg, West Virginia, to start a career. She's had a number of increasingly responsible positions with Dupont before assuming her current role. Amongst other things, she was Director of Investor Relations from 2007 until 2013. Karen was a graduate of the University of Delaware with a master's degree in chemical engineering. Next to her is Senator Blanche Lincoln. Senator Lincoln is the founder and principal of the Lincoln Policy Group, a consulting firm that assists clients in navigating legislative and regulatory bureaucracy of the federal government. She served in Congress for 16 years, including being elected to the Senate in 1998, and when she was elected, she was the youngest woman ever elected to the United States Senate. I think she has a number of other firsts in the Congress and in the Senate. First woman Democratic senator, I believe to be a chair of a major committee and chair of a subcommittee of the Finance Committee. She is a native of Helena, Arkansas, the great city of Helena, Arkansas, which I believe is the original home of Nucor Steel, or at least one of the early plant, just a little south of there. So she knows manufacturing, at least from that angle, and from many others from her days in serving the people of Tennessee. Finally, Antoinette, or Tony Leatherberry, is a principal at Deloitte Consulting. She serves Fortune 500 retail and consumer business clients. She's also participated in a number of studies done by Deloitte, sometimes in conjunction with the National Association of Manufacturers, on the issue at hand today. Amongst other things, Tony formerly served as Deloitte Consulting's Chief Inclusion Officer, driving a national initiative dedicated to improving organizational strength through diversity and providing equitable advancement opportunities for all. Tony is also a trained engineer. She holds an MBA in operations from Northeastern University and a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering with a specialization in manufacturing engineering from Boston University. We're just delighted to have all four of you. Our fifth panelist, by the way, Dr. Elizabeth Wu, was called away late yesterday evening for a company emergency and couldn't be with us today. But we're delighted to have these talented and experienced women who have not only talked the talk but walked the walk in this environment of the last 30 years. So, Teresa, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Should I stand or should I sit?
You can just
Sit? Okay. That's why the mic. I'd like to thank all of you for attending and participating in this very important discussion. I've been in the engineering profession for over 30 years, and we were talking about the same thing 30 years ago. And so today I'm hoping to advance this conversation and explore how we can actually get some convergence to actually make a difference. So let me just highlight a few statistics. You're going to be hearing some off and on today in our discussions, but I'm going to highlight a few points that tend not to get mentioned, but I believe are issues that we all need to be aware of. First of all, I'm an electrical engineer. I'm not personally in the manufacturing sector, but I certainly keep an eye on this industry. And from my perspective, I think there's a branding issue, of course. Engineers have a branding issue in trying to engage women in engineering. We also need to look at who we're trying to attract. Today we're talking about women, but as was highlighted earlier, underrepresented minorities and persons with disabilities are also not well represented. And I also try to continue to gain an understanding of what the real challenges are in this sector, but also in the high technology industry sectors in general. And then I'd like to look at identifying focused solutions that we can realistically address. But let me talk about the who. We tend to talk about the leaky pipeline and trying to engage female students at the K through 12 level, and we try to talk about what are the important points in time to try to attract them. But if you look at statistics undergraduate level, there are over 17.6 million students enrolled at the undergraduate level in all fields of study. But only 15% of those students are actually going straight from high school into a four-year program. So when you think about recruiting strategies that universities develop, spend lots of money creating, they're really targeting only those 15%. The rest of the students are really non-traditional. And what do we mean by that? These are the students that really do not go from high school right into college. 43% attend two-year schools. 37% of all undergraduates are going part-time. 32% of all undergraduates are working full-time and taking classes on the side. And at least 25% of all undergraduates are over the age of 30. And so when this manufacturing sector is trying to look at engaging women in this profession, they're not just coming out of high school. You're going to find women in all forms of life. Look at our veteran population coming home. There's a good percentage of women in those in the veteran community, supported by the GI Bill, who have attracted superb skills in the military, leadership, communication. If you don't communicate correctly on the battlefield, you're in trouble, and all sorts of skills. And these are also groups that we can target. Let's talk about the demographic tsunami happening in this country. In 2011, 50.4% of the children under the age of 1 in this country were from underrepresented groups. And these are groups that we do not engage in the STEM professions. In Texas, that number was 70%. If all the kids under the age of 1 were from underrepresented groups. California, 75%. Washington, D.C. was over 68%. So how are we going to attract these kids into science and engineering? When we're not even doing it now, they're going to be the majority. So we need to really seriously think about that. The final point I'd like to make is socioeconomic challenges. In 2001, there were 4 states in the United States where over 50% of the K through 12 students were on free or reduced lunch. In 2011, there were 17 states with over 50% of the K through 12 students on free or reduced lunch. And so we have a socioeconomic issue that's also a challenge. But today we're going to talk about women, and as was pointed out earlier, about 18% of the engineers are women. But when you disaggregate it by subdisciplines of engineering, computer engineering is about the lowest with 8.5%, whereas environmental engineering is 45.5%. So when you look at the average, 18% is not the whole story. So with that pleasant collection of statistics, I think we need to be realistic about who we're trying to engage in the conversation. So I'd like for each panelist to make about 5 minutes of remarks, and then I'm going to open the floor for questions from me and then from you. So Karen, would you like to start?
Sure. Karen Fletcher with the Dupont company. And what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about myself and make it very personal, but also relate to some of the important topics that we want to touch on today. So I'm one of those young women 30 years ago coming out of college, but maybe even going further back in high school. I was, recognized as doing well in math and science, and so, well, you're good in math and science, you ought to think about engineering. So that was the light bulb going off, but I didn't know what engineers did.
Right.
There was nobody in my family who was an engineer. I had no role model in my immediate community that I could look to for a woman engineer. But I was fortunate enough, maybe lucky, in that a guidance counselor arranged for an appointment for me with a gentleman from the University of Delaware. Well, he happened to be the chair of the Department of Chemical Engineering, and he happened to have an agenda that he wanted to recruit more women into the program. And so in a short conversation with him, he really opened the doors for me. He described to me better that what engineers did and the doors that could open to me, that it wasn't so restrictive, that I could go into environmental areas or energy areas. And back in the 70s, we were dealing with the oil embargo, and so energy was a very hot topic. So he made the connection for me. So first the light bulb went on to even consider engineering, and then the hook was set in this conversation with somebody who did become a role model, because he convinced me not only should I go into engineering, but I ought to do it at the University of Delaware. So his agenda was met, but so was mine. And so that was my start, and it was a little bit luck and a little bit fate. So fast forward 30 years, it's not good enough to tell a young girl, well, you're good in math and science, think about engineering. Just like you wouldn't say, well, you're good in biology, you ought to be a doctor. No, you talk about what doctors do and that they help people. And my argument would be, well, engineers help people, and they can do good things for the community, for the environment. And in fact, just to make it, very real, at Dupont, we're working on things like increasing food productivity. We have a large agriculture business, and so it's about feeding the world. It's about getting more production on marginal land or where water is in stressed condition. We're working on alternative energy, whether it's solar power or moving away from fossil fuels and making products in more renewable ways. We're also working on protecting the environment, protecting people and important assets. And so these are the conversations that we're having with young people, women and men, coming out of college. And so we're relating to them, not just what you're good in, but trying to touch it to how engineers help people, how we improve the quality of life. That's the hook. That's really setting the hook. And in fact, we're active all across that feeder pipeline because I see this conversation as a continuum. So it's about what we can do to attract good talent to our company, but going further back in the pipeline, how do we convince young women, people of color, to move into engineering as an avocation, as they make a choice on a major in college. We're even working at the middle school level with Girl Scouts as one example, turning them on to solving problems, to being creative, and touching that fun aspect of building something or creating something too. That's what engineers do. And we're even going into elementary schools and things like Lego leagues and trying to turn on that light bulb, and then we'll set the hook as they progress through the pipeline. So those are just some thoughts about the need to change the conversation and connect it to things that are about improving quality of life, but that people want to be a part of, and getting them back to engineering.
That's great. Hard to follow. Well, I'm delighted to be here. My name is Blanche Lincoln, and I want to thank all of the sponsors because without you all, we would not be here. And that's an important beginning. So I hope that we all take note that whether it's the Aspen Institute or AWIS or the Bartleman, is that right? Bartleman, yes. So many groups that are interested in that. In seeing this issue be dealt with. And it's very proud to be here with Karen and Tony. And I hope I have as much to give to this conversation as you all do. Much of mine has been experience, but not necessarily in engineering. Engineering my way through a man's world, perhaps.
That's right.
But there's so much to begin with. And I think that Karen touches on the idea of making things not only accessible, but understandable and something that's interesting. And then help begin to take those things and move them forward. I grew up in a home with both parents were college educated. My mother had a home ec degree. But back then, home ec meant that you had to have both organic and inorganic chemistry along with a few other things that were quite difficult. So Mother was pretty bright. She came out, an honor student from the University of Arkansas and had many job offers. At the time, she didn't realize that she would ever get job offers. She thought all she would ever be was a teacher or perhaps a nurse. And she said that's what were the options back then. She declined the offers in business and manufacturing, and my dad was in the service, an infantryman, and so they lit off in a journey around 2 tours of service. But what was interesting, I think, was that it built in my mother the idea that she could have done it. She had the mind that was capable of it. My oldest sister was one of the first women film directors in Hollywood. And you would think that, from a farm family in East Arkansas, that all 4 of us kids could actually end up doing something, 3 of us girls. was pretty amazing. But a lot of it starts with providing the education that allows people to understand not only what they're capable of, but the encouragement that needs to be there for their children. I know we had several programs early on. I come from a very poor area in East Arkansas, the Mississippi Delta of Arkansas. We started a program called Parents as Teachers. Most parents did not have much more than a 3rd to 6th grade education in those areas. And yet what we did was we worked with them to empower them with the confidence that they could help their children exceed in school, particularly the girls. And it wasn't because they could do their homework for them. It was because they could empower their children to do the work and to gain the help that they needed that maybe they couldn't provide as parents. But parents as teachers. All kinds of programs where it is critically important that we look at the nucleus of what we're dealing with. And I think that's really important. My mother had 2 rules when we were growing up. She said, I want y'all to be adventurous. I want you to, be curious. It's a sign of intelligence. All of those things. If it's rude or dangerous, you don't do it. And quite frankly, it's been a pretty good rule to live by. And I have found that even though I ended up in college with a degree, coming out of college with a degree in biology, because my father thought I could never be able to find a job with a degree in art history, so I just switched at the last minute because I love biology. And he said, well, I thought you would pick something, maybe econ or something, that might be more helpful in finding a job. And I said, well, quite frankly, I decided that if I enjoyed my education, I would have accomplished something. And I liked biology. And so going to the point that Karen makes, which is making sure that the exposure is there and the interest that becomes more than just an interest, but something that they enjoy. Particularly for women, the encouragement of what you should do and can do with that is very, very important. I've got a lot to say, and this was only supposed to be 5 minutes, so we'll move on. But I will say that when I came to the United States Congress in 1992, I was a young single woman. And my age was as big an issue as my gender was at the time. But when I got there, lo and behold, it was a huge awakening that my gender was going to be an issue. I was one of the first women to be pregnant on the floor of the House of Representatives and to give birth to twins, no doubt. I helped to start a group called the Blue Dog, some of y'all may remember, and my male colleagues said, oh great, you'll be the first blue dog to give birth to a litter. So my claim to fame just broadens. But how important it is, exposure is one of the things that I would say. Exposure from my standpoint, from a family that really valued education and opened the doors. But looking at my own family now with my boys, I have, as the mother of boys, the opportunities that exist. And they are there. As a mother of boys, I get to be a role model for the girls in the group. And that's an important role that I have to play. But when my son, my boys are going off to college next year, they were 2 when I came to the Senate, were born in the House, I suggested MIT. And they've both had tremendous strengths in math and science, some of which I attribute to the things I've encouraged them in, whether it was music early on, which I think is very important, things like Odyssey of the Mind, where there were always more girls than boys, which was wonderful. But he was totally confused. He said, why would I want to go to MIT, Mom? I don't think I want to be an engineer. And I said, do you know what an engineer is? And all he could think of was electricity, you know? And so the education of what engineers do. When I started talking, I said, you know, one of the things that I've watched engineers do is to empower the cattlemen of West Texas to grow twice as much beef on half as much land through a water conservation program.
Right.
And he was like, well, that sounds really cool. And I said, well, it's not just electrical engineering. It's not just that traditional idea of engineering. So I think breaking those norms and ceilings from all standpoints is a critical thing that's important to our kids. The last thing I would add is my husband and I both are huge supporters of public school. We're products of the public schools of Arkansas, and it was a hard road because we came through integration, and our parents were there for us. They stood with us, and it was an important thing because it gave us the exposure that we needed to know how important everybody is to solving the problems. And I would say to that end, it is critical in today's world. Our boys are in the public schools not because we wanted them to just get a public school education, but because we wanted to help make the schools better. And by making them better, then the people that my children will enter the workforce with will be better because it'll be their own contemporaries. And we've got to focus on education. We haven't reauthorized ESEA in 12 years. You spoke about nutrition. We passed a nutrition bill when I was chairman of the Ag Committee. We had not increased the federal reimbursement for school feeding programs since 1974. And we just did it a few cents. But if you think about where we've got to look at just the nuts and bolts of things, we've got to start with that. So I'm sorry I'm preaching now, and I'll stop. But I'm honored to be here and to talk about this, and I look forward to the questions from Teresa and from the group. There's so much that we can do working together.
Thank you
Thanks.
very much. Tony.
So I'll start with giving you a little bit of my background. I'm Tony Leatherberry. I started off my professional career as a young engineer. I used to play with robots and design clean room technologies for storage device manufacturing in the technology manufacturing arena. So I was really a techno geek at one time and proud of it. Still like my tech toys. And if I think about my path to getting to that first job as a young engineer, it may be a little bit different. And it may be because I did not have necessarily role models who were engineers with my parents, but my parents always looked for opportunities for me to have exposure. And so for me, growing up in Chicago, I was selected to be a part of a program called the Early Identification Program in Engineering with the Illinois Institute of Technology. And I share that with you because I think we can get back to some of these fundamentals that might have a profound impact on individuals and exposing them to opportunities and help them make choices. So that early identification program was sponsored for individuals starting in their sophomore year of high school. We would spend the summers at IIT doing computer programming, problem solving, having contests, making learning and engineering discipline fun. We spent our Saturdays there between the summers, and that program then positioned us to be recruited from the likes of Purdue and the likes of Boston University and other places. So for me, I was very fortunate in having that kind of exposure at a young age. If I dial forward to my first job, which was with Digital Equipment Corporation, as I mentioned, a young engineer in this storage device manufacturing group, and one of my former colleagues from Digital is sitting here in the audience. We started off as young engineers together. We were lucky. We ended up being recruited by a part of the organization that focused on developing talent with underrepresented groups. So they sought out women and minorities and developed that talent. And we had role models who are our leaders, and those individuals would spend endless weekends, evenings with us, helping to develop our critical thinking skills. And so when I think about the lucky experience that I had, I don't think I would be here today, sitting in front of you, without that foundation. So we have talked about why this is so important. I want to share with you a few statistics at a macro level. This is some of the joint research that Tom mentioned earlier that we've done with the Manufacturing Institute and with the National Association of Manufacturers. And let me tell you why this is an imperative to our country and globally. If you look at where manufacturing sits today, and we've done surveys to understand from a public opinion, why is it so important? 86% of those believe manufacturing is fundamental to the economic prosperity of our country. And over 80% believe it should be a strategic imperative to the U.S. Okay. Now that's the great news. Let's talk about some of the not so great news. If you ask 18 to 24-year-olds, would they consider a career in manufacturing? It ranks dead last. And one of their fears is that if I pursue this career, my opportunities will be lost because those manufacturing jobs would go overseas. Okay. So this is coming back to all of the points and the ones that Teresa made earlier about how do we attract individuals into this discipline. Now, if you think about that, it means that we have to have an integration of policy, and I think this is where Senator Lincoln was going, an integration of education. To Teresa's point, the traditional path doesn't work anymore, and then an integration from a business community standpoint to think about this as an investment in our future and not just a cost. So I want to put that out there as a macro consideration as we're thinking about how we address this and solve this problem.
Terrific, thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask them a couple of questions and then open the floor to have you all, give you all the opportunity. The first question is, what do you consider to be the 3 most important challenges to seeing women in the manufacturing work environment?
I'll start with that. I think one of the challenges, frankly, is just building the pipeline. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not just the pipeline of high school kids making their choices as they enter college, but turning on that light bulb, as I mentioned earlier, and sometimes that starts much, much sooner. And so I think one of the challenges is to stimulate and be very active in the pipeline, which becomes the feeder pool ultimately that enters the workforce. So #1 challenge. I think another challenge is I get asked frequently, what do I look for in engineers that Dupont wants to hire? And I look for technical skills as table stakes. You go to a good school, you get good grades, and so you come out with your degree, and that is that's a starting point, but it's not enough. And increasingly, what we see at Dupont, the problems that we face are more and more complex. And we need people who can work across boundaries, who can cut across disciplines. So engineers working with biologists, as an example, to solve a problem together. And so we need the skill sets that foster good teamwork, that open-minded to diversity of thought. And diversity, I use that term very broadly. Who are good communicators, because sometimes you might have the solution, but you're limited in your communication skills and making the pitch and in selling the concept. So we need a pipeline that produces not just the technical capability, but the ability to collaborate and creatively solve problems and communicate those solutions well. And I think the third challenge is actually the conversation. So putting new faces to engineers and describing what they do, not what subjects they might have been good at in school. And just as an example, last month was National Engineering Month and specifically National Engineers Week. At Dupont, we put together a number of posters, and they profiled engineers in all walks across the company, maybe product development, maybe plant-based operations, maybe research and development, or projects. And we showed the person's picture. We gave a quote of what they said, here's what I do. I'm working on solar power, or I'm helping the community improve the quality of drinking water, what have you. And then we also put a little bit of background about that person. And what it does is it makes it very personal, and it puts a face on it, and you can see yourself in these posters. And we've used them with recruiting. We've used them internally just as a moment of pride. But trying to make it very personal and enhance the conversation about who engineers are and what they look like and what they're working on, and make it very real, very tangible. Oh, they look like me. Oh, I can do that. Oh, I want to do that. And I think that's one of the challenges, is to have that conversation more visibly and kind of collectively. We're kind of one-off as one company doing this, and I think we need to be part of a broader conversation.
Thank you. Well, I want to use a word that Tony used, which was exposure. I think just exposure is absolutely critical, whether it's to the young adults that are in school, in terms of, as Karen mentions, what's the variety of opportunities that exist out there. It's not just what you may think in your own mind engineering and manufacturing is, but also exposure to manufacturing. I mean, one of my favorite parts of my job as a United States Senator was touring manufacturing facilities. And because I grew up on a farm, I didn't spend a lot of time in manufacturing facilities growing up. I didn't see what that was like. And I think that the misnomer that, manufacturing is dirty, or it's, it's clunky, or it's, whatever, how people describe it. I mean, you go into these facilities and, they are spit spot, and the technology is amazing. The computers, I used to always get fascinated with the German engineered mechanics and the robotics of some of the stuff. And I would say, well, do you have a tool and die shop? And they'd be like, well, we have to, because the parts are hard. If it's a lot of it in East Arkansas was old equipment, but it was always German. And they were like, we've got to, because finding replacements and other things like that. And they said it's the hardest thing in the world to find are tool and die people who kind of understand that. But exposing people, not just children but adults, to what is today's manufacturing. How does playing your video game relate to manufacturing? There's a lot, and I think that that's important to really dispel what some of the thoughts are that people have about manufacturing and engineering, and really see. And Karen said a lot of that too, in the sense that crossing the boundaries is important too. Being able to know that you need to know a little bit of everything. I think that was always enticing to me. I was never, really spot on the best at one something, but I liked a lot of different things, but it allowed me to put a lot of pieces together, and that's important. There are a lot of different programs to do that, and I just encourage, particularly on the private side, I think that, I was always looking for those for my children, and there's a lot of them out there, but there needs to be more. So I would just say exposure. The other thing is, I know in Arkansas we would take 5th graders and we'd send them to a college campus for a week or 5 days. Most of them from families that traditionally did not have college graduates in their family. And we'd put them on the campus so they would know what was possible. And it was an amazing program. We lost our funding, it was unfortunate it's not there anymore, but that kind of exposure to what a college campus is, and what it can mean to you. So I would say exposure. I don't know, I'm supposed to come up with 3, but I'm just going to do 1. Actually, I heard
So-
3 in there. Go ahead.
It's always hard to be last because all the brilliant stuff has been said already. But I think there are a couple of other things that I would add or pile on to the comments already made. And I think one of the biggest challenges is that we're not going to solve this problem overnight. It's going to take several years. And so the more that we lag in acutely addressing it, the longer it's going to take to solve it, and potentially the risk is the further behind we will be. So I think we've talked a lot about engineers. We also need to think about the skilled workforce. We've talked about machinists and the skilled labor pool as being also an acute shortage. So if you look at what business leaders are dealing with, they're facing that challenge of how do they address that skilled labor pool and those acute shortages over the next few years. And they see that as one of their toughest challenges, particularly in the light of many retirees that are coming up, and that knowledge transfer is not happening at the pace that it needs to happen. So I believe that's one of the toughest challenges that we have to address, is not just engineers, and we've got acute shortages there, but it's also the skilled labor pool that's needed for us to remain competitive. If you look at women, I think there might be 20% of the degreed engineers are women, and only 11% are going into a career as an engineer. I think it's attracting, so a lot of the branding, a lot of the programs, a lot of the exposure, but once they're there, how do we retain them? And that comes with sponsorship, that comes with nurturing them, that comes with helping them to continue to hone their technical craft and their critical thinking ability. And so a lot of what I've observed and hear is that many of these individuals, or the underrepresented, as Teresa mentioned earlier, still feel a sense of isolation, that it's an old boys club and that they're not connecting. And so I can certainly tell you, many years ago when I started out as an engineer, I was a little radical, so you can take that for what it's worth. But I was challenged, and I specifically remember one of my engineering managers saying to me, "You got a problem with him? It's your problem. You've got to figure it out, because you don't know if he has a bias against you because you're a woman, because you're black, because you're younger, because you happen to be in the manufacturing group and he's in the design group, and you're challenging his thinking. It's your problem. Figure it out." And so so that might have been a little bit of tough love, but if our women and our underrepresented minorities don't get that kind of tough love and support, they're going to continue to be isolated and feel like they can't be successful in this kind of arena. Now, with that tough love, he gave me a little bit of air cover and sponsorship, but that's what's going to be required, and I think those are two of the toughest challenges.
You kind of hit on a couple of things that that I wanted to bring up.
Okay.
One is we tend to discuss women in these types of fields in aggregate, and I'm wondering if you can comment about the role of women of color in manufacturing.
Right. So you're absolutely right. I do think we think about it in aggregate, and I think sometimes as I've spent time nurturing and developing women, not necessarily female engineers, but I think the problem is universal. As I've been working with younger consultants now that I'm in the consulting profession, or with even some of my clients, what we tend to do is think all women's challenges are universal.
Yeah.
And we forget that cultural norms come into play. So, for example, if you might tell one woman of a certain background, get yourself a nanny to balance it all, that might not be something culturally that she feels good about. Okay, so just having the cultural competence really has to come into play, because it is not universal. I actually did a study a few years back to understand how women felt in their own career development and progression. And some of the questions I asked was not necessarily about what their organization was or was not doing for them. It was more around how were they empowering themselves. And did they feel that they were a go-to person that their leadership sought out? Did they feel like they were on some of the most challenging assignments? Did they feel like they could bring any type of personal challenges they were facing, whether it's aging parents, whether it's thinking about raising a family, to work and share that with their leadership so that they could figure out a solution together. And it was just startling to see the difference, quite candidly, between white women and women of color in terms of their comfort level with some of these dimensions. And so I think to your point, Teresa, we have to have that cultural competence. We've got to get underneath. And sometimes it's an uncomfortable conversation, but we've got to build an element of trust in order to get underneath and have that authentic dialogue.
If I can maybe build on that, I think there's a tool that may be an enabling tool, and it's kind of simply around the concept of networking, of putting people in touch with one another and enabling those conversations to take place. So, for example, in a company setting, we have a Dupont Women's Network, we have a Dupont Black Engineers Network, an Asian group network, a Hispanic network. And all of these opportunities are out there for people to link into, to be a part of the conversation, and you start to find other people like you, whether they're wrestling with work-life balance or they're wrestling with a very specific workplace situation. Outside of the company, there are professional societies that can also help make connections and promote the dialogue, whether it's Society of Women Engineers or National Society of Black Engineers, and so on. But I think one thing from my own personal experience, and we were sharing some stories earlier, sometimes you find yourself isolated. There just aren't very many of you, whatever you is, a woman in the workplace or at a manufacturing site or somebody of your cultural background or experience base, and you feel very alone. You're surrounded by people, but you feel very alone. And sometimes it's as simply as facilitating the connections, the networking to take place that gives you that broader sense of community. And it might not be in your backyard. You might need some help making the connection outside of your work group in another part of the plant site or in another part of the company or what have you. And that makes a huge difference. I'm sorry to say we just had a woman leave Dupont not long ago, and I took it very personally. She was a Hispanic woman, and she wanted to return home to her hometown, and she just didn't feel that sense of community, and I feel like we let her down by not providing that community. And so I think that that is part of the challenge that we have to facilitate the dialogue and keep people better connected and more satisfied with their situations and their opportunities.
I'd just add, just a month or so ago, I spoke on a panel down at the Brookings Institute where they were sending their fellows to the Hill, and they wanted to know about life in a congressional office. And it was interesting. It was obviously a very well-educated group coming from agencies all across the spectrum, headed to the Hill to spend a year as a fellow in a congressional office. And there were a couple of questions during the question and answer time, but not a whole lot. And then afterwards, 3 women came up to me and said, we really didn't want to ask this question, but we've got young children, we hear nightmares about the schedule up there, what's going to happen to us when we go up there, where do we find help? And it's just what Karen said. I said, find somebody else that's, is in that boat. There are other women up there that have young families, and ask them, network with those people who can tell you. It may not be in the same office you're in, it more than likely will be, but And that networking is important. But I also will add that when we start early with our children, whether they're men or women, whether they're people of color or different origins, helping to build the confidence so that if there's not somebody in your play group that looks like you and feels like you still have the confidence to reach out. Because I know there were very few when I was in the house, and there were some men that were unbelievably supportive of me as a young woman, a single woman, and then getting married and being 8.5 months pregnant, walking over for votes, and my feet were swollen, and I mean, maybe it was just they felt sorry for me, but having the confidence to reach out is an important thing too, and I think that's something that we have to start at a really early age and encouraging in our children.
Okay, thank you.
And that can be cultural as well.
Absolutely, you're exactly right.
That's right.
That's what you were speaking to, I think, in that cultural aspect of encouraging that confidence in their own cultural setting.
I'm going to ask one more question from my list because of time. I'm going to try to combine a couple of things here. We have a lot of different groups working on this issue about women in engineering and STEM in general, and this has occurred throughout my career over 30 years. You have national initiatives, you have professional societies, you have nonprofits, you have federal agencies. How do we finally get convergence of all the activities where we can actually make an impact? And you said something interesting earlier, the fifth grader program.
Oh, yeah.
The funding went away, therefore the program went away. The sustainability of what we try to do to make an impact.
Yeah.
So I'll start, and that word convergence is a great word, because I do think, I think I mentioned this earlier, it's an intersection of government, policy, business, and education. And Edie Fraser and Tim Wells are actually here from STEM Connector, and they're doing just that. They're trying to engage in that dialogue that moves the needle forward by integrating those three components so that we can push out programming, that we can push out thought leadership around these kinds of opportunities for our young people, and building that pipeline, creating that bridge from the younger community all the way to these STEM careers. So I think continuing to find those programs that work, and maybe one of our biggest challenges is then figuring out how it scales, right? Because there is a lot of good stuff that is going on. Karen talked about the program right there in Wilmington that she has been leading. A lot of great stuff going on. I think we've got to look at a collection of it and understand what is really working, how can we scale it, and the impact, so that we have a scorecard of moving that needle forward. But it's going to take all three. One dimension of it can't do it alone.
I just think when you talk about convergence, and I don't know if, my vision of that is, as you were talking about a continuum, that's not the end of the continuum, but towards the middle, towards the latter part of the continuum. And I still have, unfortunately, I guess, I don't know, maybe not, but the focus is on the beginning of that continuum, and that is education. It's life skills, Head Start, Even Start. These are programs that build life skills and competence. Then you get them into school, and there's programs like Odyssey of the Mind and others that you can get them into that are going to focus on that kind of stuff. We have to think outside the box. There's a KIPP school in my hometown where we had students performing on a 26th percentile, and that first year of graduating class at the KIPP school, 100% college acceptance. It was amazing. And it involved a lot, not just good teachers and not just a school, but it forced parental involvement. I don't want to say force, that wasn't a good word, but it demanded. It demanded parental involvement. And those are things that are going to be a critical part of that continuum when you get to that convergence. The reason it was the 5th grade was because we now know that if you wait until a student is in middle school before you give them that exposure, it's too late. All of their socio-cultural pressures, it's too late to get their full attention. And if you don't get it before the 6th grade and they start middle school, they're going to be on the downside of what you can encourage them to do. So the convergence is, you're talking about bringing all these groups together, but I think it's important to look at that continuum that Karen mentions, because that continuum is important because each step provides that building block that gets those young people into the interest of the STEM programs and the confidence that they can do it. And I think that's, I don't know, maybe I'm talking too much.
You know, Tony and I were talking before the panel started, and we have a great example of convergence, and it's the space program. You know, the mandate, we're going to put somebody on the moon by the end of the decade, and everybody got in stuck with that. And it's hard, right? I mean, there are competing agendas, and lots of good initiatives, and all demanding time and resources. And it has to be something that we can all rally behind. So I think it's desperately needed. It may be our competitiveness that's hanging in the balance that we can certainly all rally behind, and we all need to work together on the pipeline, that continuum. We may have an opportunity for a short-term convergence, something that is coming upon us, ready or not, and it's really two things hitting us at once, two headwinds, I would say. One is we have a lot of baby boomers in the workforce that are moving on, and that is leaving a sizable vacuum in terms of experience and talent and capability that is creating this suction, this pull for engineering and technical talent to fall in behind. We talked about some precious skills that we're really losing very rapidly. So we have that as one headwind, and it's an opportunity, right, that's going to stress and put demands on the feeder pool. The other thing that's happening is on the heels of shale gas and cheap natural gas, we're seeing a renaissance in this country around large projects that are going after the capture and the conversion of this cheap raw material. And so it's not only the petroleum companies who are putting big projects in, going after low-cost gas, but it's also then converting that gas into basic raw materials, and that's creating another demand for engineering and technical talent. So we're finding an extremely competitive marketplace with a lot of demands on that pipeline that we all have an interest in, a vested interest in being successful there. And again, it comes back to competitiveness and the quality of the industries across the country. So that may be a short-term stimulus or convergence point, and I would agree that we need to think also longer term in a sustainable way about how we can all be working together to create a healthy and ongoing pipeline.
But some of the greatest manufacturers in my former congressional district were those that utilized what you were talking about, the baby boomers, bringing them in mentoring programs to show some of these young kids in the community. They were retired management in manufacturing. And if you read the article in the paper, I think it was yesterday, about the baby boomers at retiring, and one of the comments was, well, we rode around in a Winnebago for about a year and realized that was kind of worthless. And we wanted to find something challenging and somewhere where we could give back. Those people have to be asked, though. It's not something that they normally do, but the kind of mentoring programs that manufacturing can bring into their facilities through those baby boomers is important. Very good.
Okay, with that, I'm going to open the floor, and you were first, and then go ahead.
Hi, I'm Edie Fraser from STEM Connector, and thank you, Tony. It is all of us working together. We got in this because we found $1.3 trillion being expended on STEM education, but not that continual pipeline. And so we cover all of that, and thanks about the 2.8 million jobs and the great work that the manufacturers are really doing. And today we've got a Career Accelerator Day going on in 6 communities across America where manufacturers are opening up their plants to kids and family and hope to build upon that in successive years. Tony knows about it well, and Dupont has been involved, so thank you. But just very quickly on the women's side, because you're talking about exposure for the girls and clearly the role models, Karen, that you've talked about at Dupont and the posters and Tony's, but with the Manufacturing Institute and 53 other organizations, we really looked at its mentorships and sponsorships. You know, sponsorships occur 3-to-1, male over female in corporations, and we need both. So we've kicked off this Million Women Mentor campaign, and we've already got the 51,000 pledges to mentor. We've got 24 million girls ready to be mentored, so just go to millionwomenmentors.org, give us your cards. But I think it's all working together to make sure that we get that mentoring and sponsorship up the system. So thanks to the Manufacturing Institute for its partnership, but I think together we will make the difference if we really focus on everything that you all have talked about, and to Senator Lincoln for all you've done on public policy through the years, because Tony, you've talked about bringing it all together. It really has to happen.
Thank you. Yes. Yes. And then right behind you is next.
In diplomatic speak, you've all been talking about the use of soft power. And hard power is money, if I may make that analogy. And for both sexes, for both genders, you know, there are simple solutions that never seem to see the light of day. If you triple the amount of money in a Pell Grant for people studying engineering or physics, you could pay for that by reducing the subsidies for online colleges with 3% graduation rates. It would be revenue neutral. But the question I have is hard power, meaning people are smart. They move by money. High school kids worry about money in college. College kids worry about money in terms of where they're going to go to graduate school, and about workers, which I think is the largest issue. I wrote a book last year called Made in America. I went to 4 successful factories, spoke to the workers, spoke to managers. They all thrived through the recessions. They pay real wages. I personally don't believe there's a skills gap in the United States. There's an unwillingness for workers, not senior people. There's an unwillingness to pay the proper wages. When you pay a skilled machinist $12 an hour, $12 an hour being a barista, but they have to go to community college to become a skilled machinist. The numbers don't add up. The point is this: people really respond to hard power and to money. So from a public policy point of view, what are your thoughts? What do you do with money both for STEM overall and specifically, I don't know if you can legally for just for women, but people in this country are profit maximizers. They'll move and they'll do where the money pulls them. It's an addition to the soft power things that you're talking about. So do you have any opinions about how money can be used in whatever fashion to be able to pull people into technical professions, and especially women into technical professions?
Well, I've mentioned a couple of them already. I mean, I think you have to start with making an investment early, and having to fight so hard for programs like Head Start and Even Start to get these kids started with the kind of confidence that they can start first grade. If I were the mother of a first grader right now, I would be in front of Congress picketing. We have wasted over 10 years where we could have learned from the education bill what worked and what didn't, made those changes and put them into place. But we haven't. We just keep extending as opposed to reauthorizing educational opportunities and putting money behind them. It's not sexy. But you know what? Sexy issues are the ones that get dealt with. Crisis issues, nobody talks about it like it's a crisis. And that's what Washington reacts to, is glamorous issues and crises. And we need to be thoughtful people. We need to be people that are saying, we're talking about, the future of our country. And it starts today. And we're gonna start by investing in kids and education. We're gonna start by investing in manufacturing and the kind of jobs that are going to be there. There was an interesting fact I saw the other day. of the baby girls that are born today, over 50% of them will live to be 100 years old. So we're not just talking about getting somebody to 65 anymore. My husband's grandmother lived to be 112. Lived in her own apartment. I mean, remarkable. She was well educated, and she would tell anybody, she'd say, this is what allows you to live a long and fruitful life. So I just think that you're talking about resources. You're right, hard money, and making sure that people know, whether it's not just parents and moms and dads that are crying for things like education and nutrition and other things like that. It's also big business, because you need we need the workforce that it can produce.
So I agree with the challenge. I think the thing that we have to consider is probably twofold. One is we could start inflating, and maybe that's too strong of a term, but inflating those wages. And if, again, we don't think about it longer term, what will cause is a structural cost issue. And our manufacturing base is facing a lot of challenges, and this is where I go back to policy. So it's trade, it's repatriation of cash, it's taxation, it's all of those things that have to be looked at together to address this, because I'm dealing with all of that, so guess what I can squeeze and control, right? And so I think that's a challenge that the U.S. manufacturing base faces. And so unfortunately, I don't know that the solution is that easy if we don't look at all of those dimensions as opposed to just one.
You have to look at all of them.
And I just want to emphasize something, because we're talking about reactionary strategies, and putting a man on the moon by the end of the decade is a proactive, very ambitious, bold thing to do. So I find it interesting that we're talking reactionary. So I just wanted to point that out. Yes.
Jerry Jazanowski, affiliated with the National Association of Manufacturers in the past, and then the Manufacturing Institute, and now Everfi Corporation. And I just want to congratulate the panel on what I think is, for me, the big takeaway from the day, which is to focus on the personal images delivered to kids about the contribution that they can make to the country through manufacturing and through engineering, having labored a long time at how to get these kids motivated, and now looking at online technology to do it. It all has to do with the kind of things that Karen, you stressed, but all the rest of you stressed. It has to do with convincing them that energy conservation, improving the environment, making things better, being creative, and show them visual images, or take them on plant tours, or explain to them one-on-one what that's all about. Once they get the image in their head, as you said very aptly, Karen, the light bulb goes on. So I just encourage all of us to think about all the positive images we can of women in manufacturing, and find ways, either online or in the classroom, to project those. The posters idea was wonderful. I mean, this whole notion of plant tours, I mean, and the videos, the YouTube videos can do a lot. So thank you, and if you've got any other ideas with respect to how to project that, I'd sure love to know about it.
Maybe I can just give an example, and thank you for your comments. Obviously, I feel very passionately about that, making it personal and putting a face on it. Last month, we had 140 Girl Scouts descend on a local high school. It was a Saturday, but Dupont sponsored this event called Engineering Your Tomorrow. And so what we did is we took the Girl Scouts, put them in small groups, and then took them through different workstations. And they built something, or they solved a problem, or they made a lava lamp. They did these things with their hands, and we were trying to turn that light bulb on. And fast forward, just as one example, one light out there. There's a woman at Dupont, Kate McRae, and she was in that audience 10 years ago, and the light bulb went on for her, and she remembered specifically one of the breakout sessions. They froze a copper penny with liquid nitrogen, and then they smashed it into a lot of pieces. And she, to this day, has the remnants of that penny sitting on her desk. You know, and it was that turning on that light bulb, making it fun, you know, and we set the hook. And we just need to do more of that, because you just don't know how many light bulbs you're turning on, or how many courses just got changed because you made it very real to that person, and they could see themselves in your example. And we need to do more of that.
And there's so many opportunities now with, I mean, different types of science. I mean, used to be it was the potato. You know? We all got to do the potato chart.
Potato conduit, right?
But you remembered it.
I do.
Yes, sir.
Quick question. Thank you. I'm with the Small Business Administration as their entrepreneur in resident, and one of the questions I wanted to ask all of you is, where do you see the biggest short-term and long-term impact plays for women to actually get involved in the first place in the manufacturing business nexus? Is it small businesses and being part of the maker community and being a mom and pop shop owner? Is it joining big corporate companies like Dupont or Xerox or whatnot? Or is it actually going into academia from pre-K through 12 education, or at the college level, and starting at that role? So like the short long-term plays, I can see education going long-term, I can see small business maybe being short-long, but I wanted to hear your perspectives on how to make the short and long-term impact plays work.
Should be all.
Yeah, that was my reaction. All of the above, right? And it kind of comes back to the individual and what really turns them on, and where can they see themselves. I mean, for me, I was always hands-on. I was my dad's best helper. You know, I liked carrying the toolbox around. I wanted to get my hands dirty. So for me, it was a no-brainer. As much as my professors, you know, tried to talk me into academia, I knew I needed to go and get dirty in a plant somewhere. But you know, it depends. Some people are natural teachers, and so you know they choose a different road, or some just have that, you know, that desire to be their own boss, and small business makes sense. At the end of the day, you have to be true to yourself and what really turns you on, and make your work your passion. And I could see any of what you described as a great place to start.
Absolutely.
And the other thing I would say is, nothing's ever cast in stone. Try it and pursue it. If it's not what you thought it would be, then make the change. You know, that's the beauty of having a solid engineering degree. You can take that and open all kinds of doors. And you know, I had some friends from college that are now patent lawyers. You know, so that you can go in so many directions. So we shouldn't be afraid to make the leap either, even if you think you took a wrong turn.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Hans Müller for the German Association of Engineers, or Association of German Engineers. One comment about the subject is manufacturing and manufacturing engineering, really, as a subset of engineering.
Right.
Many of the comments apply to all types of engineering.
Right.
I think manufacturing engineering has suffered in the last 20 years because we have not valued it very highly in many ways. And I think it may have been inadvertently a byproduct of various financial strategies like assets light, outsourcing. It has created the impression that it is something that isn't a competitive advantage anymore.
Right.
So you pass it on, everybody can do it. I think we're seeing the light. It is a very important competitive advantage because there is something that you cannot duplicate in the laboratory, and that is to make something millions of pounds or liters or in numbers. There's an experience that you cannot recreate, that is very, very expensive to recreate once you have lost it.
Right.
I would just say to that, we had a tremendous amount of manufacturing in Arkansas with windmills. We had 3 turbine plants. We had the blades. And when you go into those places and see, oh my gosh, the technology and the manufacturing skill that goes into that kind of stuff was pretty amazing. So you're right, it's a huge part of the competition.
Yeah, just maybe a couple of things to throw out there as some thoughts. One is we have to demystify, well, what does it mean to work in a manufacturing plant? I personally had some of my most interesting and fun experiences. You know, there's nothing like getting a call in the middle of the night that the plant is down and you're the one that needs to come in and fix it. And you know, the adrenaline rush and thinking on your feet and solving problems. I mean, that's what it's all about, to work in a manufacturing environment, as well as the technology and the advances that are made to constantly up your game. So we have to kind of expose people to that, and I go back to the role models, you know, putting very visible role models out there so you can see yourself in that environment, see what success looks like. Those are some of our challenges.
There's somebody.
Hi, I'm Gloria Weens from the Advanced Manufacturing National Program Office. And one of the questions I have, and Tony Leatherberry actually kind of pointed it out, is we've been encouraging our children to really go into the higher levels. You know, we want you to be at the highest, you got to have your PhD or whatever. But a lot of the gap here we have is in the workforce, the labor part. So basically my question is, how do you attract women to the skilled workforce as an alternative to being the engineer versus being an engineering technician, and yet have them feel that they have an opportunities that are not second class to it? And that's what I see, maybe something that we actually created in our wanting our children to be the best of everything.
You know, I think that's a great insight, and you know, there are programs and organizations out there that are focusing on that. One that comes to mind is the Greater Philadelphia Urban Affairs Coalition, where they are really trying to look into the communities and figure out how to, particularly I think with young women, help them create opportunities for a trade. I remember one woman that resonates with me because they did do a video on her, and she went back to vocational school. She was trained to be a carpenter, and so there she is building houses, right? And so to your point, it's not always about the advanced degrees. It's looking at our workforce as a whole and determining how we tap into this unskilled talent that with a little bit of push, we can have them be productive members of society. So I think we have to look at that as well.
I know, working with the heating and air manufacturing folks, as well as the heating and air technicians, in the trade schools, there was an incredible school that the manufacturing industry supported and actually provided scholarships, but nobody knew about them. Which, if you think of the technology, I went to the Smart House when I was visiting out in Silicon Valley, where, you know, you turn on your air conditioner when you're at the office, at your home, or, you know, you lock the door, do whatever. I mean, the technology that's involved and the education that is forthcoming to be able to take those jobs in the technology field, I mean the tech field, the service field, they're good paying jobs. I mean, on average in the steel industry, it's like $70,000 annually. I mean, that's not a bad salary to make in Arkansas. It's a good salary, you know, but the technical schools and knowing that, one, there are those skills that you can get there, and two, that there are scholarships that are sponsored by the manufacturing industry to get you into that 2-year degree with an expertise that's going to get you a job that really does pay well, is an important part of educating, particularly women.
And I would just add that I think some of the same principles apply about making it personal, putting a face on it, demystifying what that opportunity is at the end of the line. That's all necessary, you know, at the vocational and technical schools as well. So I think of it all together.
Do you have a...
Cliff Waldman from API. Let me interject a quick note of opportunity. Female labor force participation, which had been increasing since World War II, about 2000, is leveling off and actually starting to fall a little bit, show signs of starting to fall. That means that female labor supply is going to go from a plentiful resource to a relatively more scarce resource. And that puts pressure on employers. That can be sort of a policy point, an opportunity point. It means employers are going to have to be smarter about work-life balance policies, about investing in their female technical talent, because male labor force participation has been falling since World War II. So what's happening on the female side of participation is going to create some angst. So maybe that's the point of leverage, where you start the policy. For your own good, Mr. and Mrs. Employer, you're going to have to sort of, realize that this is not a limitless pool, that you're going to have to invest in your female technical talent, your female talent generally speaking. So I think the very broad demographic here is going to be favorable toward some change.
But to that point, you absolutely have to think about the workplace environment. I mean,
culture of the workplace.
The culture of the workplace. Again, I was in the middle of a debate about childcare, and myself and only one other woman sat on that panel. And when it broke my heart to hear one of my colleagues say, "Well, can't their grandparents just take care of them?" There needs to be a knowledge of what a workplace-friendly place needs to be, and what are the things that make women feel comfortable and confident that they can be there, and that it's not just educating them, it's making sure that everything else and that goes for men too. I mean, Evan By and I used to have to sit at the back of the room because both of our spouses worked. Sometimes we had to leave because we were parent in charge. So there are those things that just make sense in the workplace, whether you're man or woman, but it definitely will be more pressing on the women.
Right. And I think Karen said it about that feeling of isolation and the woman that she mentioned. When you talked about that, I thought about the broader community. If I'm in Northwest Arkansas and I'm coming to a community, are there hairdressers that can do African American hair? I'll just put it out there. Are there, churches that I feel comfortable with? These are the conversations that are had very privately, but they're real. And they are the ones that will make someone decide they can't make it here. And so we can't just think about what happens in the four walls of that organization. We have to even consider the community at large.
Very true.
Did you still have a question?
Very Robert Schroeder with International Investor. First, a very quick comment. I enjoyed and heard a lot of very good ideas, but if you want to see a great YouTube rendering of what the new workplace looks like, there's, I think, a new Volkswagen plant. I'm not sure what the website is, unfortunately, but it's eye-opening to see what the future manufacturing plant might look like somewhere in Bavaria, I believe. I'm sure you could find it. But my real question is, a lot of us, when we grew up at an earlier age, a lot of what you're describing is being formally introduced in the structures of working places, but we were fortunate enough to receive the training informally. A lot of what you're describing as young males moving into the marketplace, it just happened naturally. No matter how dim-witted we were brought aside and said, Sharetta, this is how it works, this is what you do, this is how it... We just read a conference board report. Corporate training resources are down 38% in the last 12 years. We think it's much greater than that, frankly speaking, because we see programs being cut everywhere. So my real question is, I think that there are some contradictory policies, and whether it's correct or not, the perception by parents and students is, we're not only losing our manufacturing edge, but those jobs are continually being outsourced overseas, or H-1B visa students are being brought here to take those jobs because they'll work for less. And those are the perceptions we have to overcome, I think. So do you have any thoughts on how those ideas can be addressed too?
Well, I'm not sure I can solve all the country's problems and answer that question, but I will give you a real example. At Dupont, we're thinking about trying to move away from our dependence on fossil fuels. And so what there is there's a renaissance underway around bio-based starting points, meaning that they're renewable and we can regenerate our raw materials. And to that end, we're building a plant in the middle of Iowa to make cellulosic ethanol. So we're starting with corn waste, corn cobs and the stover. We take part of that off the field and we leave part behind. And that is now the ingredient, the starting point for making ethanol. So we're not in the food versus fuel debate. But my point is there's a lot of opportunity in that regard for renaissance in the area of biotechnology, not to mention what's happening to take advantage of low cheap natural gas. So I do see some renaissance happening in terms of manufacturing. The type of work is, I would say, maybe more highly skilled, more tailored, and the training is available, to bring the workforce up to speed and to not only start there, but to stay ahead of new advances in manufacturing technology. So that's one example of something, in our world in terms of stimulating more job opportunities and where we see the growth.
But Robert, I want to underscore what you said because, again, some of the research that we've done with the Manufacturing Institute really suggests that. It suggests that when you look at the opportunity that our manufacturing base has, a lot of that informality, pulling somebody aside, coaching them that way, versus formalizing these competency models and saying, what kinds of experiences does someone have to continue to grow, to continue to be technically competent, to continue to develop their leadership skills? That is a real opportunity. Our research is reinforcing that as well.
Yeah, I thought I saw you raising your hand. We'll take this one and then the one.
Cindy Simpson with the Association for Women in Science. I want to thank the panelists and Dr. Maldonado for a very interesting discussion. I also want to thank the individuals that are in the room to promote women and girls going into STEM, because that means our association will be around for a long time. Because we focus on not only getting people into the pipeline, but keeping them into the pipeline.
Right.
And the issues that are facing women today as it relates to the STEM community are such that have been talked about for a long time. We've been around for 40 years, and those issues haven't changed. I'd like to ask how we can, as an association that represents individuals in STEM, bring together the collective community so that we can make changes moving forward in a proactive manner rather than be reactive. And I would welcome any and all comments on that subject.
That's the convergence question.
That's the convergence question.
Yeah.
I would just say some of them are very simplistic, and we've been talking about them for a long time, but we really don't do much.
Right.
I mean, the fact is that when women get into the workforce, they more so than men have to leave and come back, whether it's to care for children or to give birth or to take care of aging parents, which means their retirement is less. They usually live longer, which means they spend whatever combined retirement they have oftentimes as a caregiver, which means they have left less than, just what I've watched and experienced myself in my own family, with older sisters and a mother. So I think it's important to remember that those are issues that we just tend to gloss over. Not only do they have less in terms of sometimes the financial power, but Social Security, they're in and out, the workforce more. So they've got less at the end of the day. When they come back after 3 years, I got to tell you, coming out after spending 18 years up on Capitol Hill, 16 of which somebody was always doing something for me, and I had to come out and start learning all of the technology of how to answer 2,000 emails in one day, was overpowering. But just, when you're out of the workforce for 3 or 4 or 5 years, it's one heck of a continuing education course you got to go back to get back in and to know which Microsoft product people are using these days, and just those kind of things. So I think we have to realize that some of the most simplistic of problems and challenges for women in the workforce are just mechanical.
And on top of that, you're going to live to be 100.
Exactly.
So
I would encourage you to take advantage of today's social media and communication tools and create
Like the
the
YouTube.
Conversation, stimulate the conversation, have virtual meetings where women can log in and participate in or receive the benefits from a panel discussion, and make it very specific thematically. So the best advice I ever got, things like that that anybody might have an interest in, and you can come up with your own creative lists. But there was a session a couple weeks ago, the Global Marathon for Women, and I don't remember who it was sponsored by. Do you?
I think it was Discovery.
Discovery, sponsored by Discovery, and it was over the course of 2 days globally, dozens of countries participating, and they put out a preset agenda with panelists or guest speakers, and you could come and go into that dialogue, and it was wonderful. And you could type in your questions, and the panel would take them, and you could tap into something that was of interest to you, or a problem that you were contemplating, and hear how somebody else solved that problem. But I think the more that you can connect people who are otherwise isolated, or don't know where to go with their problem, or thinking about, one of the panels was about changing direction in your career. Maybe that's not something you want to talk about at work, but here was a panel of women who had done that, and you could send in your question or get the confidence to make the move that they had made. So I would just encourage you to think about how to use modern tools to expand your virtual network.
So one other thought that I have, and I think organizations such as yours have this awesome opportunity. My humble observation, we, and I'm talking specifically around women right now, we do a lot to help women develop and learn how to be a better leader and fix themselves. We do very little to help leaders understand how to nurture female talent.
That's true.
And I think there is an awesome opportunity to, leveraging off of what Karen said, have that dialogue. Because I remember telling my boss one day, that honey-do list that your wife gives you? Well, guess what? I have to write that one for my husband and still do what you do. So I think that we look at the individual and what can we do to help them be better? But we're not necessarily always thinking about how we invest in our leaders to help them be better.
I work with the One campaign, and they have a mommy blog, and it's what you're saying. It's these, and most of them are professional. They've stepped out of the workplace in order to, they've got 3 kids, and they hit the ceiling in terms of what the cost benefit was, and so they're on these mommy blogs, and they're mostly talking about global hunger and things like that really eat away at them. But those kind of conversations with modern technology, I think Karen's absolutely right. You can really draw people out into a venue and have those conversations that really gives a comfort level to.
Okay, I think we've reached the usual finishing time here. I want to thank our panelists for a wonderful discussion. I learned a lot. I hope you all did. Please join me in thanking the panelists for being with us.
We're adjourned.
I guess we're
adjourned. I guess so. Thank you so much.